he invited her to watch him win. He did not consider that she might arrive prepared. It was a bright June morning in the year 1819 when Leopold Stirling, Duke of Ashworth Vale, sent an invitation to the one woman in England he had not spoken to in 8 years. And sent it, the narrator will tell you plainly, not out of any belated remorse, but out of a calculated cruelty he had spent a good portion of that 8 years perfecting. Leopold was 35, and he was marrying that particular June into a fortune considerable enough to settle debts that had accumulated on his family's estate since his first wife's death 3 years before. A wife he had married for money the first time as well, in the frantic aftermath of his broken engagement to Rosamund, and had never once loved beyond a comfortable, distant fondness that had made her death from a winter fever a quiet grief, rather than a shattering one. This second match was arranged with the same cold practicality that had governed every important decision of his adult life, to a wealthy cit's daughter whose father wanted a title for his grandchildren badly enough to overlook the Stirling name's more recent reversals of fortune. It was, Leopold told himself, his final and complete triumph over a difficult decade, and he had decided, in the particular petty logic of a man who has never once examined his own conscience too closely, that the triumph would taste sweeter still if the one woman who had once, in his own telling of the story, ruined him, were forced to watch it happen from the very front pew. Rosamund Kane had not ruined Leopold Stirling. The truth of that summer 8 years gone was a great deal uglier than the story Leopold had told himself and everyone else ever since, and it was a truth only 2 living people knew in full, Leopold himself and the woman he had just invited to witness his wedding. 8 years before, Rosamund Kane had been the eldest daughter of a prosperous shipping merchant, engaged to marry Leopold Stirling, then a young man of good family and dwindling means, in a match both families had approved with genuine warmth. It was that same year that Leopold's own father, drowning in debts he had concealed from his son as thoroughly as from the world, had engineered a fraudulent shipping venture using forged documents bearing the Kane trading house's own seal, a scheme that collapsed within months, ruining 3 merchant families and sending a wave of scandal through the city that demanded, urgently, a name to blame. Leopold's father had provided one, Rosamund's own father, framed with sufficient care and sufficient forged paper that the elder Kane, already frail and unable to properly defend himself before he died of the shock and shame of it within the year, took the whole blame to his grave. The engagement itself, before the scandal broke it, had been a genuinely happy one, the kind neither family had needed to arrange with any particular pressure. For Leopold and Rosamund had known each other since childhood, their father's friendship predating either of their births, and Leopold could still remember, with a clarity that had haunted him every year since, the summer evening he had proposed to her in her father's own garden, both of them laughing over some small private joke neither could later recall, entirely certain of a future neither yet knew would be stolen from them within the year. "You are the only person who has ever made me feel clever rather than merely titled," Rosamund had told him that evening, breathless with a happiness she had not yet learnt to guard. "My father says a man who loves you for your mind rather than your name is worth marrying twice over. And I find I agree with him entirely. Your father is a wise man," Leopold had said, and meant it, not yet knowing how thoroughly his own father's schemes would soon prove the opposite of everything Josiah Kane represented. Leopold had known the truth of what came after. He had found, going through his father's private papers after the old man's own death that same terrible year, proof enough of the real scheme to clear the Kane name entirely, Letters in his father's own hand, forged seals matched precisely against the family's genuine stamp. A whole careful architecture of fraud laid out plain for anyone who troubled to look. And he had sat with that proof a long agonized night, remembering the garden and the laughter and Josiah Cain's warm, trusting friendship, and had burned it anyway, quietly, alone, in his own study fire. Because clearing Rosamund's father would have meant exposing his own, and Leopold Sterling. 22, and suddenly the whole weight of a failing estate on his shoulders had chosen his family's name over the truth, and had broken his engagement to Rosamund within the month with a public letter expressing his shock and betrayal at discovering, as he put it, exactly what sort of family he had so nearly married into. Rosamund Cain had left London in disgrace that same year. Her family's business ceased to pay debts that were never truly hers to owe, and had gone with her widowed mother and one loyal old clerk to rebuild what she could of her father's trading connections from a rented office in Bristol, starting with nothing but a small brass compass that had been her father's own. Stamped with the Cain & Sons mark, he had once been so proud to carry on every outbound ship. She had spent 8 years since building that nothing into something considerable. A shipping trade that now ran 12 vessels between Bristol and the Indies, a reputation for scrupulous, unimpeachable honesty that had won her the trust of merchants who remembered exactly how the Cain name had once been wronged. Warehouses along the Bristol docks bearing her own name in fresh paint over the ghost of her father's older sign, and, in the last 2 years, a quiet, patient project she had pursued through a chain of intermediaries so careful that not even London's sharpest gossips had traced it back to her, the systematic purchase, at considerable expense, of every note and mortgage attached to the Sterling family's ancestral estate. It had begun, if she was honest with herself in the private hours when honesty cost nothing, as something very near a private vengeance, a slow, patient collecting of exactly the kind of power that had once been used to destroy her own family without warning or mercy. She had learned of Leopold's coming marriage and of the invitation he had sent her with such calculated cruelty. From her own solicitor, who delivered both pieces of news in the same visit, the wedding date and the final confirmation that Rosamund Cain now held, outright and unencumbered, the whole of the mortgage debt securing Ashworth Vale itself, the very estate Leopold's new bride's dowry was meant to finally settle free and clear. Rosamund had sat a long while with both pieces of news, and had decided, with the same patient deliberation that had rebuilt her father's shipping trade one careful contract at a time, that she would accept the Duke of Ashworth Vale's invitation after all. She arrived at the church on the morning of the wedding in a gown of deep, unfashionable grey rather than any colour that might have suggested she came to celebrate, composed and unhurried, and asked, of the startled footman at the door, to be shown to a private room where she might have a brief word with the groom before the ceremony began. A request unusual enough that the footman, recognising her name from Leopold's own guest list, and sensing correctly that refusing her would cause more trouble than granting it, showed her through. Leopold Sterling, dressing for his own wedding in a small anteroom off the church's vestry, turned at the sound of the door and found himself looking, for the first time in 8 years, at the face he had spent a considerable portion of that time trying to convince himself he did not still see in certain unguarded dreams. Rosamund, his voice, to his own visible irritation, was not quite steady. "I confess I did not expect you to accept." "I confess I did not expect to," Rosamund said, entirely composed, and drew from her reticule a folded document sealed with a ribbon Leopold recognised, with a cold drop in his stomach, as belonging to his own family's solicitors. "I have not come to make a scene at your wedding, your grace. whatever cruelty you intended by the inviting of me. I have come because I hold, as of this morning's confirmation from my own solicitor, the entire mortgage debt securing Ashworth Vale, and I found I could not in conscience let you stand at that altar promising a bride's father a clear and unencumbered estate when the truth is rather different, and I am the one now holding the difference. Before the wedding guests filling the church nave that morning could learn precisely what had detained their groom, there was a long, terrible silence in that small anteroom in which a Duke read, in his own family's solicitor's careful hand, exactly how thoroughly the woman he had invited to witness his triumph had instead arrived holding it entirely in her own two hands. If a story of a debt finally, fully called due, in every sense the word could carry, is the kind that keeps you listening, stay, what happened in the hour that followed changed the whole shape of that June morning. Leopold read the document twice, his face draining of colour with each line, and when he finally looked up, the careful cruelty he had planned for that morning had collapsed entirely into something rawer. "You could ruin me with this," Leopold said low, "call the debt due this morning, before I've even said my vows, and Miss Thorne's father will withdraw the whole marriage settlement the instant he learns the estate isn't clear. You would have every right. God knows I have given you every reason. I know precisely what I could do with it, Leopold," Rosamund said. "I have thought of very little else for the better part of 2 years, in truth, ever since I began quietly buying up your family's debts. I told myself, in the beginning, that I wanted the power to ruin you exactly as you let your father ruin mine. The same public disgrace, the same sudden collapse of a fortune everyone believed was secure. I have held that power in my hands for some months now, Your Grace. I find I have not yet decided what to do with it, and your invitation this morning rather forced my hand on the timing." "Then why come at all?" Leopold said, "if not to use it?" "Because I wanted to look at you once more before I decided," Rosamund said, "and see whether the man who let my father die disgraced for a crime his own father committed had grown into someone worth sparing, or merely into someone better dressed for the same cowardice." Her composed voice, for the first time, carried something rawer beneath it. "I have spent 8 years building a fortune out of the wreckage you and your father left of mine, Leopold, and I find, standing here, that I am considerably less interested in your ruin than I once believed I would be. I am considerably more interested in the truth finally being told, plainly, by the one person who has known it all along and let my father's memory carry the blame instead." Leopold Stirling stood in his own wedding finery, with his family's whole fortune and future balanced in the hands of the one woman he had wronged most thoroughly in his entire life, and felt, for the first time in 8 years, the full weight of the cowardice he had spent a decade dressing up as necessity. "I burned the proof," he said, hoarse. "The night after my father's funeral, I found letters, contracts, everything that would have cleared your father's name entirely, and laid the whole scheme at my own father's door, and I burned every page of it in my own study fire, because clearing your father meant destroying what remained of mine. And I was 22 and terrified, and I chose my own name over the truth. I have told myself every year since that I had no real choice, that a young man newly responsible for a failing estate could not afford the scandal of his own father's exposed fraud. I find, saying it aloud to you at last, that it sounds exactly as cowardly as it was, and I do not know how to make 8 years of that cowardice right with a single conversation before my own wedding." "You cannot make it right with a single conversation," Rosamund said. "But you can begin making it right today, publicly, in front of every witness you invited here to watch your triumph instead." She held out a second document, one Leopold had not yet noticed her carrying. I have had my own solicitors prepare a full account of the original fraud, drawn from records I was able to piece together over the years from surviving correspondence and the testimony of two of the other ruined merchant families, who have their own grievance against your father's memory and are entirely willing to see the truth told at last. I do not need your burned proof, Leopold. I have built my own case in the years since, patient piece by patient piece. The same way I built everything else I now hold. I am prepared to make it public today, in this church, before your bride's own father, unless you choose to make it public yourself, in your own words, before I am forced to do it for you. It was, the narrator will tell you, precisely the choice Leopold Sterling had spent 8 years avoiding, and he stood a long moment in that small anteroom with his wedding waiting beyond the door and his whole carefully maintained fiction of a name balanced on the answer he gave next. The muffled sound of the church organ already beginning its opening notes in the nave beyond, as though the whole world outside that small room had already decided, without him, exactly how the morning was meant to proceed. I will tell it myself, Leopold said finally, whatever it costs me. You have carried the weight of my family's lie for 8 years, Rosamund, and I find I am done adding to it for the sake of one more comfortable morning. The wedding proceeded, in its opening moments, exactly as the assembled guests expected. Leopold Sterling walking to the altar with the composed correctness of a man executing a well-planned triumph. Miss Thorne arriving on her father's arm in a cloud of expensive silk, the vicar opening his book to the familiar words. It was Leopold himself who interrupted the ceremony's proper course, rising before the vicar had gotten 3 lines into the service and turning to address the assembled congregation with a plainness that made the whole church go still. Before this ceremony proceeds, Leopold said, I find I must correct a wrong I have let stand for 8 years, because I cannot in conscience begin a marriage while still living the lie that ended my last engagement. He did not look away from the crowded pews, though his voice was not entirely steady. 8 years ago, my own father orchestrated a fraudulent shipping venture using the forged seal of the Kane trading house, ruining 3 merchant families and letting Josiah Kane, an innocent man, take the whole blame to his grave. I discovered the proof of it after my father's death, and I burned it, and I broke my engagement to his daughter Rosamund with a public letter accusing her family of the very crime my own father committed, because I was afraid of what the truth would cost my own name. I have carried that cowardice 8 years, and I find I am no longer willing to marry into a fresh fortune while an old debt of honesty remains unpaid. The church erupted into a startled, scandalised murmur, and Mr. Thorne, the bride's own father, rose from the front pew with a face gone thunderous. You mean to tell me, Sterling, that you are confessing to fraud on your own wedding day, in front of my daughter and half of London? Thorne demanded. I mean to tell you the truth, Mr. Thorne, which is a debt I owe considerably more than I owe this marriage, Leopold said. I will not ask your daughter to marry a man who let an innocent family be ruined and said nothing for 8 years. If she wishes to withdraw, I will not blame her, and I will settle whatever costs the broken arrangement causes your family from what remains of my own resources, however diminished those may soon become. It was the Dowager Duchess, Leopold's own mother, who rose next, her carefully composed face gone rigid with fury, and made the second and considerably more dangerous move of that extraordinary morning. This is madness, the Dowager said, sweeping down the aisle toward her son with the particular commanding authority that had once orchestrated the entire original scheme. Leopold, You will stop this at once. Whatever guilt you imagine you owe that woman, you will not destroy this family's last chance at solvency over an 8-year-old business matter no one but the two of you remembers or cares about." She turned, sharp, toward Rosamund, standing quietly at the edge of the nave. "As for you, Miss Kane, I do not know what scheme brought you to this church today, but I will have the footman remove you from these grounds before you cause my son one further moment's foolish guilt." "You will not, Your Grace," Rosamund said, and her voice, though quiet, carried the length of the stunned church. "Because I hold, as of this morning, the entire mortgage on Ashworth Vale, and I am considerably more entitled to stand on these grounds than any footman is entitled to remove me from them. I would remind the assembled company, since Her Grace has raised the matter of who orchestrated what 8 years ago, that the fraud in question was not my scheme, nor my father's, but the late Duke's own, a fact I have documented thoroughly enough that I do not need Leopold's confession alone to prove it, though I confess it was rather more than I expected of him this morning, and I find myself, for the first time in 8 years, genuinely surprised by a Sterling's conduct. The dowager, cornered before the very congregation she had hoped to command, reached for the only weapon she had left, a furious, wounded appeal to family loyalty that fooled no one in that church any longer, least of all her own son. "I did what was necessary to save this family, and I would do it again," the dowager said, drawing herself up with the particular icy dignity of a woman who had never once, in her whole life, been made to answer for anything before an audience she could not control. "Your father's business dealings were his own affair, and a great many families suffered reversals that terrible year, Miss Kane. I hardly think it fair to lay the whole blame at a dead man's door when he is no longer present to defend himself." She swept her gaze over the assembled, whispering congregation. "I will not stand here and be lectured on honesty by a merchant's daughter who has spent 8 years plotting her revenge under the guise of business. I have spent 8 years rebuilding what your family destroyed, Your Grace," Rosamund said. "And if this morning is the revenge you fear, I would remind you that I have called nothing due, ruined nothing, and asked for nothing beyond the truth finally being spoken aloud in the same church where your family's lie was never once corrected. That is not revenge. That is considerably more mercy than your family showed mine." The congregation, which had gathered that morning to watch a duke's triumphant remarriage, instead watched the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth Vale exposed before her own son's wedding guests as the architect of a fraud that had killed an innocent man through grief and shame. And the murmur that carried out of that church within the hour told an entirely different story than the one either Sterling had planned for that June morning. More than one guest present that day, families who had once done business with the Kane trading house, and quietly wondered, over the years, at the abruptness of its ruin, exchanged glances that suggested old suspicions, were only now, at last, finding their confirmation, and by evening the story travelling through London's drawing rooms carried Rosamund Kane's name not as a cautionary tale of scandal, but as a woman finally, thoroughly vindicated. Miss Thorne, to her own considerable credit, did not weep or rage. She rose from her seat beside her furious father and crossed to where Leopold stood and regarded him a long, thoughtful moment. "I confess I never loved you particularly, Your Grace, and I suspect you never loved me either, whatever our fathers arranged between them," she said, with a dry composure that suggested she had known the true shape of the match all along. "I find I am not entirely sorry to be spared it, however dramatic the manner of the sparing. I wish you well settling your accounts, Leopold, in every sense the word carries this morning." She turned and walked back to her own father, and the two of them left the church within the quarter hour, considerably richer in dignity than they had arrived. It was Leopold who crossed, at last, to where Rosamund stood at the edge of the emptying nave, and the whole weight of 8 years passed between them in the silence before either spoke. "I do not know what to ask of you now," Leopold said. The whole church emptying slowly around them, servants already beginning the awkward, murmuring work of clearing decorations meant for a celebration that had never properly occurred. "I have no fortune left worth offering, no name left uncomplicated by scandal, and I have just publicly confessed to the very cowardice that once cost you everything. I would not blame you for calling the debt due this very afternoon and leaving me to whatever ruin follows." "I do not want your ruin, Leopold," Rosamund said. "I told you that this morning, and I find it is still true, even now, even after watching you finally say aloud what should have been said 8 years ago." She drew from her reticule the small brass compass, worn smooth from years of carrying, and turned it once in her fingers before meeting his eyes. "I want to know whether the man standing in front of me now, stripped of every comfortable lie he has told himself for 8 years, is someone I could learn to trust with something considerably more valuable than a mortgage. I do not know the answer yet. I find I would like the chance to learn it properly, in the open, without either of us hiding behind our father's sins any longer." She held out her hand rather than any warmer gesture, and Leopold took it, careful and uncertain in a way that suited the fragile new honesty between them far better than any grand romantic declaration could have that morning, and what settled in both of them, standing together in the quiet ruin of a wedding that had gone entirely unlike its planning, was not a triumphant ending, but the plain, hard-won beginning of something neither had believed that morning they would ever be permitted to have. They did not marry that year, nor the next, choosing instead to build, slowly and deliberately, the trust that 8 years of lies had made impossible to simply assume. Leopold working, with Rosamund's own considerable shipping expertise guiding him, to rebuild the Sterling estate's finances honestly rather than through another arranged fortune, and Rosamund watching, with the same patient care she had once applied to a rented Bristol office, exactly what kind of man Leopold Sterling meant to become, now that his father's lies no longer governed his choices. There was an afternoon in the 2nd year of that careful rebuilding. Leopold bent over a set of shipping accounts at Rosamund's own Bristol office, learning the trade from the ground up at her insistence rather than simply receiving her charity, when he set down his pen and looked at her with an expression she had not yet seen from him in all their renewed acquaintance. "I keep waiting for you to tire of teaching me," Leopold admitted. "A duke learning a merchant's ledgers at 9 and 20 must strike you as a fairly absurd spectacle." "I find it strikes me as exactly the opposite, Leopold," Rosamund said, not looking up from her own work. "A man willing to sit in a rented office learning a trade he was raised to consider beneath him is a man doing considerably more to earn my trust than any grand gesture could manage. My father built this house from nothing twice over, once as a young man, and once, had he lived, he would have had to do a second time after your father's fraud. I find I respect a slow, honest rebuilding a great deal more than I ever respected the easy fortune you were raised to expect without earning. I do not think I fully understood until this last year how much easier it always was for me," Leopold said, quiet. "I resented the debts my father left me. I never once stopped to consider that the debts were, in their own way, a kind of freedom compared to what your family lost entirely." "No," Rosamund agreed, "you did not. But you are considering it now, which is more than I believed possible 8 years ago, watching you sign that letter breaking our engagement. She looked up at last, something warmer than mere business assessment in her steady gaze. "I find that counts for a very great deal, Leopold, however late in coming." It was in the 3rd year. On an evening neither of them had planned for any particular significance, that the careful professional distance they had maintained finally gave way. They had worked late over a difficult contract, the office quiet around them, and Leopold, gathering the last of the papers, found Rosamund watching him with an expression he had learned over 3 patient years to recognise as her rare, unguarded one. "I have loved you twice now, Rosamund," Leopold said, low, setting the papers aside. "Once as a boy too foolish to know what he was about to lose, and once now as a man who has spent 3 years learning to deserve the chance to say so. I do not ask you to answer tonight. I have learned patience, if nothing else, in this rebuilding. But I find I could not go on working beside you, day after day, without telling you plainly that the loving never once stopped, not even in the 8 years I spent telling myself it had." Rosamund set down her own pen and crossed the small office and took his face in both her hands with a gentleness that answered him more thoroughly than any words could have. "I have been waiting 3 years for you to say that without needing to prove anything further first," she said, and the kiss that followed, quiet and certain in the lamplit office where they had rebuilt so much together, settled at last the whole long question both of them had been too careful, for too long, to ask aloud. The Dowager Duchess retired from London society entirely within the month, her own standing too thoroughly ruined by the public reckoning to sustain her former influence, and lived out her remaining years in quiet, unforgiven obscurity at a small dower property, visited rarely by the son who had finally chosen honesty over her comfortable version of events. She wrote to him twice a year, brief and unrepentant letters that Leopold read out of a dutiful sense of what remained of family obligation, and answered with the same careful, distant civility, having learned, in the years since that terrible wedding morning, that some relationships could be maintained without ever again being trusted. The 2 other merchant families ruined alongside the Kanes 8 years before received, through Rosamund's own patient efforts, and a portion of the settled mortgage funds, a measure of restitution that came a decade late but was received, by both families, with a gratitude that told Rosamund plainly how long an unaddressed wrong could go on quietly starving a family's fortunes even after the scandal itself had faded from London's shorter memory. They were married at last 3 years later, quietly, at Ashworth Vale itself, the mortgage long since settled honestly between them as part of the marriage's own proper accounting, rather than any lingering leverage, with the same 2 merchant families standing witness alongside what remained of both their own diminished circles. A wedding considerably smaller and considerably more genuinely joyful than the one it had taken the place of. Rosamund brought the small brass compass with her to her new home, setting it on the mantel of the estate's own study, the same room where Leopold had once burned the proof of his father's crime, as a small permanent reminder of exactly how long a debt of honesty could be owed, and exactly how much better it settled, in the end, than any debt of money ever could. Their own children, born in the years that followed, grew up hearing the whole story plainly rather than any softened version of it, for Leopold had decided, somewhere in those 3 careful years of rebuilding, that a family's truest inheritance was not its name or its fortune, but its willingness to tell its children exactly where both had come from, and what it had once cost to finally set the accounting right.